When last we met, which was, I'm sorry, quite a while ago, you'll recall we were discussing Louis XIII. And you'll recall he was only 8 years old upon his father's assassination. His father was Henry IV, the founder of the Bourbon dynasty, which is where we are. And his mother, who was from the powerful de' Medici family, the ruling family of Florence in Italy, she became the principal regent. Well, being a de' Medici, she knew how to rule, and rule she did. In fact, Louis, when he was 15 years old, had to lead a palace coup to overthrow his own mother. And her advisors, the Deconsinis, who were also from Florence, and in order to take the throne for himself. But he quickly realized, as 15 years old, come on, he quickly realized he needed help. And ironically, he fell back on one of his mother's trusted advisors, who happened to be a clergyman named Richelieu, who became his chief minister in 1624. 2 years earlier, and by the way, here's what Louis probably looked like at the age of 5, which is about how old he was when his father died. But anyway, Richelieu, 2 years before he took over in 1624, he was appointed Louis's chief minister. He was awarded the cardinal's cap. He became a cardinal. So he's known in the history as Cardinal Richelieu. And by the way, here's his mother. So let's talk about Cardinal Richelieu. Here's how Louis looked a little bit later. And here is Cardinal Richelieu wearing the red of the cardinal, which is where we get the word cardinal to describe the red color. I don't know, maybe it came from the bird too, I'm not sure. But Cardinal Richelieu will become one of the more, if not most, powerful persons in French history, particularly for a non-monarch. He wasn't, of course, a monarch. And that, I have to qualify that, that's if you don't count Napoleon, who did, however, make himself emperor in 1804. So technically he was a monarch anyway. And you may have met Cardinal Richelieu if you read Alexandre Dumas and his Three Musketeers. He didn't like Cardinal Richelieu. Dumas did not. And so he's treated as kind of a ruthless, secretive, hypocritical schemer who he referred to as his Red Eminence. Fact is, Cardinal Richelieu was hated in his own time, even by Louis XIII himself, who resented his dependency on him and could barely conceal his delight when he finally died. But the king could recognize ability and competence, as well as policies that did him far more good than harm. So he allowed him to virtually run the country. In 1630, Louis's mother and the king's brother conspired to get rid of the cardinal because of his, unfriendly policies towards Spain, who they were trying to get an alliance with. But when Richelieu's spies, and he had many, reported the plot, he outwitted them and won over the king, who gave him a dukedom, and his position was secure from then on. Fittingly, this event is known in French history as the Day of the Dupes. Richelieu was not only an effective principal minister for 2 decades, from roughly 1624 to 1642, the year he died, but he also bequeathed to Louis XIII and the young Louis XIV, his successor, of course, another advisor, a protege of his, who was also from Italy, and his name was Giuliano Mazarini. Originally a papal diplomat, but from the early 1630s, Mazarini came into the service of Richelieu, who made him a cardinal. And he is known in French history as Cardinal Jules Mazarin. Would then serve as the principal minister until his death in 1661. These two cardinal ministers, you might call them, effectively established the form of absolute monarchy that will be embodied by Louis XIV, who hopefully we'll get to today. Richelieu's plan was simple. Make France the preeminent nation in Europe and make the king supreme in France, while at the same time containing the religious strife that had nearly ruined the country over the previous century. He was constantly matching wits with the king's brother and other nobles who sided with the Habsburgs, the Habsburg royal family of Austria, who were running Spain at the time. He did this by destroying their castles and executing those he suspected of treason. In fact, one of his victims was the king's lover, who was introduced to Louis by Richelieu himself. Richelieu wanted to use him as a way to influence the king, but when he participated in several revolts against the cardinal, he was executed. It did cause a strain with the king, but he remained in power. The king didn't fire him. He also had to cope with the Protestant rebellions, which threatened to upset the fragile peace brought about by the king's father, Henry IV. In 1627, Richelieu ordered the army to besiege the Huguenot stronghold of La Rochelle. You may recall that after the Wars of Religion, the Huguenots, the French Protestants, the French Calvinists, were allowed to maintain strongholds, fortresses, armed fortresses, because Henry IV, who had recently converted, he was a Huguenot, but he had converted to Roman Catholicism in order to become king, promised them the protection of the French army. But when they said, oh wait, the French army can't be everywhere, so he allowed them to maintain several dozen armed fortresses throughout France. The strongest of them was at La Rochelle, a port on France's west coast, or near a port on the west coast anyway. The cardinal personally commanded the besieging troops. He's going to wipe them out. Richelieu ordered the army to besiege the fortress there. The English King Charles I, remember the one that got his head chopped off, the English King Charles I even declared war on France to help the Huguenots. English troops under the Duke of Buckingham led an expedition to help the citizens of La Rochelle, but failed abysmally. The city was able to hold out for over a year before capitulating in 1628. Richelieu even dared to ignore the Pope's request that the Edict of Nantes, remember the edict that granted religious freedom to the Huguenots, the Pope, of course, very much opposed to that. The Pope ordered Richelieu to rescind the Edict of Nantes, which he refused to do. He refused to do, which he rightfully recognized that the time was not right for that yet. But there is perhaps no greater example of Richelieu at his best than his actions before and during the 30 Years' War. So let's talk about the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, and I've mentioned it before, and I told you we would be talking about it in greater detail when we get to France. Well, there we are in France, and I'm talking about it in greater detail. And we'll probably talk about it some more when we get to the German states. 30 Years' War is sometimes called the First Modern War. It started out as a purely religious war, which is hardly modern. But it ended up very much a political war fought to maintain the balance of power among the growing nations of Europe. It is also one of the most tragic of Europe's wars. And when you talk about Europe, you got a lot of wars to choose from there. One of the most war-torn areas on the face of the earth throughout history, if not the most. The devastation it left in its wake, particularly for the peasants, was horrible. It also severely weakened the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs, but it left France probably the dominant power of Europe. And you'll see why as we go through it. The war began in Bohemia. Where's Bohemia? Well, when you think of Bohemia, think of today's Czech Republic. This area right here. Remember when Czechoslovakia was created after World War I? They created it, and they just took a chunk out of Germany and a chunk out of the Austrian Empire and created, presto magicio, there's Czechoslovakia. Well, today, Czechoslovakia has broken into two nations, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, because those two tribes didn't get along very well. As the old song used to say, the whole world is festering with unhappy souls. Yeah. It started in 1816 as a religious conflict brought on by repression of the Protestants. When I say Protestants here, I'm talking about Lutherans and Calvinists, and we've talked about who the Lutherans were and who the Calvinists were. But mostly in this case, Calvinists lived in that area. And they were being oppressed by the Habsburgs, the ruling family of Austria. Very, 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 very powerful, if not the most powerful family in Europe at the time. And they were Catholic. The Habsburgs are Catholic. Okay? They ruled the Holy Roman Empire, which, with every tick of the clock, is becoming less and less and less important. As Voltaire said, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, and he was right. It was, okay? Or it was not. When what happened when the heirless Holy Roman Emperor Matthias died, Ferdinand, a Habsburg Catholic, was elected to take his place, even though the Protestants, particularly in Bohemia, supported Frederick V of the Palatinate, a German kingdom, a small German kingdom. But when Ferdinand became Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor, he sent two Catholic counselors to act as his representative to Prague, to Rodney Castle in Prague, in May of 1618. Ferdinand had wanted them to administer the government in his absence. On May 23rd, 1618, an assembly of Protestants in Prague seized them and threw them, and another member or two of their retinue, and threw them out the palace window. And they were 2 or 3 stories up, which about 70 feet off the ground. But remarkably, they survived, apparently falling onto a dung heap. This event is known as the Second Defenestration of Prague. Defenestration means to throw someone out the window, in case you were wondering. Marks the beginning of the Bohemian Revolt. After that, the Protestants revolted, and that was it. They revolted against the new emperor, not wanting to accept a Catholic as their ruler. That, over the next decade or so, will involve most of the major nations of Europe. This seemingly innocent little event, kind of like World War I started with a seemingly, well, not quite so innocent little event, the murder of an archduke and his wife, started World War I. But this throwing somebody out the window and who survived is going to just explode all over Europe. The Habsburgs and their Catholic allies, mainly Spain, had the upper hand in the early going. So one by one, the Protestant powers of Europe joined in to stop the Catholic Habsburgs from expanding their territory. Back in those days, there were no borders. You couldn't buy a map that showed, well, when you stepped over this line, you just walked from one country into another. They didn't have that back then. Because all the territories were controlled by people, by counts and dukes and kings and queens and so forth. And if they decided the next day they were going to take over Lord A's manor, then their land just got bigger. But they didn't bother to put out a map that had the lines that showed the borders. Borders was a very strange and virtually non-existing thing at that time. But stay tuned. The northern German states, who were primarily Lutheran and Calvinist, but in Germany, pretty much the Lutheran, since Luther was from Germany. Denmark was primarily Lutheran. Sweden, primarily Lutheran, invaded the German territories, winning some battles and losing others. Throughout these phases of the war, Catholic France was forced by traditional allegiance to the Catholic side to give them aid and comfort, since they were a Catholic nation. But that allegiance amounted to little more than lip service, while Richelieu and Louis XIII secretly supported the Protestants. Believe it or not. And if the Pope was upset with Richelieu, his own cardinal, for not rescinding the Edict of Nantes, I wonder how he feels about this. Okay? Now why? Why would Catholic Louis XIII and Catholic Cardinal Richelieu support the Protestants? Good question. Let's look at a map, another map. This map shows you the Habsburg areas of Europe. Anything in red or yellow could be construed to be Habsburg. Red because they're controlled directly by the Habsburgs, and yellow because that's the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire was ruled by Habsburg. So the Habsburgs, if you were marrying your daughter off to somebody, you'd want to marry her off to a Habsburg. That's what you would do, and that's what they did. That's what everybody did. This is what Richelieu saw when he looked at the map of Europe. He saw France surrounded by Habsburgs everywhere he looked. Okay? And the Habsburgs, don't get me wrong, this was not a wasted time, a wasted worry, because the Habsburgs had always dreamed of owning all of Europe. That was their goal, that was their dream. And if they could take over the Protestant countries, all the better. They could force them to go back to the Catholic Church, okay? Remember, well, this proves the oft-stated supposition that Richelieu, in spite of his title, Cardinal, Richelieu was a political man. He was not a religious man. And this is just one of those proofs. There's going to be another one in a minute. After a disastrous Protestant defeat in 1635, Richelieu could not wait any longer. Because up till now, France had given lip service to the Catholics, but had pretty much remained out of the war. They would give monetary support to the Protestants, but that's about it. Well, he decided after 1635 he couldn't wait any longer. Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIII take Catholic France into the 30 Years' War on the side of the Protestants. Okay? Hard to believe, but that's what he did. And the war began to turn slowly toward France and its allies, mainly Sweden and the just mentioned Protestant states of Germany, who were the Protestant allies of France in this war. Believe it or not, perhaps France's greatest ally was none other than Protestant Sweden. Now today we think of Sweden as that ultra-liberal, socialism's wonderful, they are neutral in all the wars. They were neutral during World War II, although they supplied Germany with a lot of its steel that they built Messerschmitts and Bismarck battleships and U-boats with, but never mind that. Okay, sorry. Anybody here Swedish? I'm sorry. But Sweden was a major military power in Europe at the time. And they were led by one of their greatest kings at the time. Gustavus Adolphus was his name. And I'm sure the horse was a little bit bigger than that, carrying around, okay?
What was his name?
Gustavus Adolphus.
Oh, yes.
Okay. You met him.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Whose nickname was, you remember his nickname?
Sam.
No, it wasn't Sam. He was known as the Lion of the North, the Lion of the North. And in one of his most brilliant moves, Cardinal Richelieu had earlier negotiated a treaty with Adolphus in January of 1631, offering him a 5-year subsidy, money, to march south into the heart of Europe against the Habsburg forces. And march south he did. Eventually, this quote-unquote, it's known in history as the Swedish March, would not end until they reached the Danube River near Vienna, which is pretty far south in Europe. Okay? Now, this action also illustrates another one of Richelieu's pragmatic principles of foreign policy. And that is, and I quote, that my enemy's enemy is my friend. Okay? Soon, however, Richelieu realized that Sweden's success in this war was turning into the proverbial tiger by the tail. His anxiety grew as Adolphus crossed the Elbe River in eastern Germany into Saxony, where in September 1631 he defeated imperial forces. When I say imperial forces, that means the Holy Roman Empire. Okay? Imperial forces at the Battle of Breitenfeld, perhaps Sweden's greatest victory. By the end of the year, he seized Frankfurt on the Main River in the northern part of West Germany. And by Christmas, he had reached the Rhine at Mainz. In the spring, he conquered Bavaria, which is most of the southwestern part of Germany today. And by now, he realized he was overextended, and he began to retreat north into northern Germany. In November 1632, he won the Battle of Lutzen. But here, Sweden's greatest king was killed in the battle. And Sweden will continue to retreat after that. So much for Sweden's role in European history. Although they'll be sticking around for a while, there'll be other kings that will come along who will like the medal.
You say the greatest king, was that the guy?
Of Sweden. Greatest king of Sweden.
Okay,
Although that's questionable. That's the guy on the little horse, yeah. Sam, right. If you will. France's good fortune at this juncture in the war, however, was a series of misfortunes which befell its chief adversary, Spain. For the Spanish kingdom remained essentially a hodgepodge of regions, united only by religion and the Habsburg dynasty. And in 1640, two major provinces, Catalonia and Portugal, rebelled against Madrid, seriously distracting the Spaniards. Catalonia is where Barcelona is. And they're always rebelling against this. They're threatening to withdraw from Spain right now, as we speak. So nothing's new. France, in contrast, was increasingly becoming a unitary state, thanks to Cardinal Richelieu, where religious divisions mattered less than the overriding quest for national security under the crown of Louis XIII. Just the opposite of what was happening in Spain. Well, as I told you, Richelieu dies in 1642, and the king followed him to the grave just 5 months later. It's as if he couldn't rule without him. But by then, both sides were exhausted, both sides in this war, the 30 Years' War. And some participants, and by the way, did you notice the dates up there? It really is 30 years, isn't it? And I already told you the story about how, with my students in class, I always had a question on the test. How long did the 30 Years' War last? You remember that story, don't you? The only reason I did that was because, you know, believe it or not, I hate to tell you this, and I didn't have too many of them, at least by this time in the year. There were kids who just didn't care about school, about education, the future, themselves. And when it came time to take a test, they would just take their pen and pencil and go A, B, C, A, B, C, A, B, C, A, B, C, A, B, C. But I would throw a question like this on it, because then the next day, when I discussed the test, I'd tell the whole class, guess what? After they laughed at me, just like you did, I said, guess what? Somebody missed that question. And they all went, no. And that person that was doing ABC, they're like, covering up their papers, see? So eventually I broke them of that habit because they knew there would be questions like that. And so they would always ask me, well, is that question going to be on our next test? No, I had to take it off. I had to take it off because I was afraid that I had ruined the self-esteem of those who missed the question.
They deserve to.
So I took it off. Anyway, see what happens when you get me started? Anyway, yeah, Richelieu dies in 1642. The king dies 5 months later. And some participants in the war had already signed peace treaties, but the war was now Louis XIV's and his regent, Cardinal Mazarin, who I just mentioned. French forces won several more victories, but exhaustion and a total of over 8 million dead led to negotiations for peace, which culminated in 1648, the year the war ended, in a treaty known as the Peace of Westphalia, under terms very favorable to France and Sweden, and unfavorable to Spain. The Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Empire also kind of lost out on this one. This would begin what would become a time-honored practice of rewarding lands to the winners and taking away lands from the losers. For example, Sweden was given land on the southern shore of the Baltic, which was part of Westphalia at the time. Previously part of the Holy Roman Empire, but they lost it. Switzerland was recognized as independent of the Holy Roman Empire. Even though the Swiss Republic had been founded, the Holy Roman Empire still claimed suzerainty over Switzerland. Well, this treaty gives Switzerland its independence. Okay. France was given lands along the Rhine, east of the Rhine, and lands in northwestern Italy near Milan. And this practice of rewarding the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, the treaty makers giveth and the treaty makers taketh away, this practice will culminate in the famous, or maybe I should say infamous, Treaty of Versailles. Remember the Treaty of Versailles, don't you? That's the treaty that ended World War I. That's the treaty that recognized Czechoslovakia, that created Czechoslovakia, because they were punishing those Austrians and Germans. And then along came a guy named Adolf Hitler that says, I'm going to get even with you. And he kind of did it. He kind of did. Although he lost in the long run, as we all know. The Peace of Westphalia, this treaty, also established the precedent of peace established through diplomatic congress, rather than through a clear-cut victory by one side or the other. There wasn't a clear-cut victory. There was definitely a victory for the French side and the Swedish side, but it wasn't a clear-cut one. They didn't completely conquer their enemy. Okay, they held negotiations and arrived at a peace treaty through that. It also inaugurated the new system of political order in Europe. This is a very important treaty. This is one of the most important treaties in European history. A very important practice based on peaceful coexistence among sovereign states, where each of these different colors on the map represented different nations. Interstate aggression was to be held in check by the concept of balance of power, wherein no one power, no one nation would be allowed to become too powerful, causing the other powers to unite against it, thus adopting Cardinal Richelieu's main idea. And a norm was established against interference in another state's domestic affairs. As European influence spread across the globe, these Westphalian principles, especially the concept of sovereign states, each with its own defined borders. They thought, you know what? We'll all be better off if we can draw lines on a map. And that's why these lines are so heavy black lines. If we can draw these lines on a map and all agree that this people are here and these people are here, and we have to respect their territory and their right to control their borders. Sorry. Don't throw anything at me, okay? Yeah, that's where it comes from. And the whole idea was this will keep the peace. Now, it didn't, but it was a good attempt to do that. And all maps since then have had borders, although some people want to do away with that, don't they? Okay. This would become central to the first time people began to talk about something called international law. International law. And to maintaining the prevailing world order. The treaty also upheld some traditional concepts that had already been upheld in previous treaties. For example, the new treaty incorporated the old concept, the Latin expression cuius regio, ius religio, which means whatever religion the ruler is, that's what religion that nation will be. And the people will be obliged to be of that religion. Okay? They were expected to follow suit. The options were limited to Catholicism, Lutheranism, and now Calvinism. Okay? However, Christians living in an area where their denomination was not the official one would have the right to practice their faith in private or public sometimes during certain hours. This treaty and the following Treaty of the Pyrenees between France and Spain are generally recognized as the beginning of French preponderance in European affairs. France will now be the dominant power on mainland Europe. Now, why do I have to say mainland Europe? Because of who? These guys up here, who are on an island, and very wisely recognized early in their history they were an island, and therefore they maintained a powerful navy, because they knew none of these Habsburgs, none of these Richelieu's troops, none of these Bourbons can march over our line into England, because they're an island. They'd have to walk on water to do that. So if they maintain a powerful navy, so much the better for them. In fact, both of these treaties, just to show you an example of how France was preponderant here, both the treaties were written in French. Other than, up till now, they've all been written in Latin. Okay, so there you go. Well, so there's the 30 Years' War, one of history's greatest wars. And it did last 30 years.
In the map where you have France,
Yeah?
there is a small green territory inside of the French.
Right here?
Yep. Oh, no. A little further.
That's Savoy. That's called the Kingdom of Savoy.
Further north.
All that to the left.
Here?
No.
Further north.
In France,
It's in the middle of France, or in the
down
lower
near,
part of France.
down near Marseille.
It's a yellowish color.
That's yellow.
Oh, yeah, it is. What's that? I don't know. Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
It doesn't say what it is on there. I have no idea what that is. Maybe a printer dropped some ink on it when it printed it. I don't know. I have no idea. Back to Louis XIII. Let's move on. For most of his married life, Louis's relations with his queen, Anne of Austria, it was a political marriage because she was a Habsburg, were formal and correct, but by no means loving, much less passionate. Once again, I think I mentioned this to you before last time, he was believed to be either homosexual or bisexual. His many love affairs with various men and women of the court left him emotionally drained, as you can imagine. Most of them, no comment, Louis XIII, most of them ended violently with the king's favorites going to the gallows. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Nevertheless, their recognition of the primary obligation of dynastic marriage, that is to produce an heir to the throne, survived both their relative mutual indifference toward each other and over 20 years of failed pregnancies and miscarriages. Eventually, on September 5th, 1638, a son was born to the ill-matched couple. He was formally christened in April of 1643, less than a month before his father's death. An amusing, if revelatory story, not sure it's really true. After the ceremony, the boy visited the dying king. And was asked this question: "What is your name now?" Solemnly, he replied, "Louis the 14th," thereby revealing at an early age that besides knowing basic arithmetic, he could add 13 plus 1, he possessed the burgeoning sense of self-esteem. And when you look up self-esteem in the dictionary, it's got a picture of Louis the 14th right next to it. He had it in droves.
How old was he then?
Probably 3 or 4, 5 maybe. He would have 72 years. Louis the 14th will have 72 years, more years in which to hone that image, and hone it he did. Well, anyway, as I just mentioned, Louis the 13th followed Richelieu to the grave 5 months after bringing a little 4-year-old boy, 5 months later, bringing a 4-year-old boy, also named Louis, sorry about that, to the throne, who would make quite a splash and reign for the next, count them, 72 years, the longest reign in European history. Elizabeth's getting close. She's not there yet. She's the longest reigning English monarch, but she's not the longest reigning monarch in European history. That's Louis the 14th. Okay? Sorry, Liz. But hang in there. You're doing a good job of hanging in there.
How
Okay?
long is her reign so far?
Well, she's in the 68 something, 68, 69, something around there. I don't know, subtract. She became queen in 1952, so that's 48 years, and then what's 48 plus 18? 66 years. Okay, so she's getting there. By that time, however, Richelieu had largely set up the central state machinery required to subordinate local and religious interests to the national interest as represented by the king. After all, this is a monarchy. He had subordinated provincial officials to state commissioners appointed by the king, forbidden parliaments to discuss state affairs, and gain control of opinion by censoring the press. He had both maintained the independence of the country and enhanced its prestige through his sponsorship of the arts, having founded the French Academy, the present Royal Palace, and created the distinguished art collection, much of it which is in the Louvre today. In short, he had established a general framework for the glory days of absolute monarchy that will come under Louis XIV. Except, of course, that with another damaging regency looming with Louis XIV became absolute monarch in 1643, a boy not yet 5 years old. It looked like deja vu all over again, as the danger-fraught days of the regency will have to run their course before the sun can rise, just as we saw in the case of Louis XIII. So, without further ado, Louis XIV. The Sun King. He liked that title, the Sun King. S-U-N. Okay, and he always said, "I am the state," but in English it doesn't sound as good as it does in French. L'état c'est moi. Sounds a lot better in French, doesn't it? A lot of things sound a lot better in French, come to think of it, you know? It's a beautiful sounding language, isn't it? And there actually is no direct evidence that even Louis XIV said it. Okay, but certainly a lot of people said it about him. And by the way, whether he really said it or not doesn't matter. He might as well have. The most famous painting you'll ever see of him is by Hyacinthe Rigaud. Rigaud, I don't know how you would pronounce that. Rigaud. Being only 4 years old meant France would enter another dangerous regency. Actually, Louis had two regents, his mother, Anne of Austria, and godfather, Cardinal Mazarin, just mentioned. And by the way, it's just possible they were lovers. Although there's really no real proof either way. In fact, they may have even secretly married. There's some historians that say that's a possibility. But luckily for Louis, this cardinal shared the instinct of his mentor, Cardinal Richelieu, and had Louis's best interests at heart. So in truth, there were two great cardinals, Richelieu and his protege Mazarin. Upon Mazarin's death, when Louis was but 22 years old, his way had been well prepared. So he ended the regency and took over. And take over he did. Probably his greatest asset was his health. In spite of 4 generations of ignorant doctors, haphazard but incompetent attempts to destroy it, given the state of 17th century medical science at the time, or maybe I should say lack thereof. He was fit, athletic, an accomplished dancer, and excelled in horsemanship and hunting. He appeared to be a gracious young man who exhibited that great sense of dignity he would become so famous for. By most contemporary measurements, he was not an intellectual. And he felt he could face the world on his own terms, which he mostly did. Mazarin had left for him a Europe at peace and some very talented advisors and ministers. Furthermore, Louis had a ringside seat as he observed the master Mazarin in action up until the time he was 22 years old. His biggest problem early on was the many revolts of the nobles, or in France they were referred to loosely as grandees, as they were called, caused mostly by high taxes. The Parliament of Paris, remember the Parliament of Paris was more like a court than a legislature. Don't think of the Parliament in Paris as the Parliament in England. Two different things, but the same word. Confusing. It was full of judges who yearned for some of that royal power that had been taken by Richelieu and Mazarin and soon to be handed over to this new king. So they also became a source of rebellion. But Mazarin proved as adept as his master Richelieu in playing them against each other or bribing them, paying them off to not pursue the goals they had and to pursue different ones. Louis was brought up believing that the only way for a king to prove himself was through war. He will spend a great deal of his reign in this endeavor. His first sojourn into this activity was a little war called the War of the Devolution of 1767-68. Here Louis tried to seize the Spanish Netherlands, today Belgium. Think of Belgium, the southern part, all of Belgium, all of the Netherlands, and then Belgium broke away. 1830 finally became independent. But back then, Spain controlled it. Okay? That's why most Belgians are still Catholics, because the Spanish Habsburgs ruled them, whereas if most Dutchmen today are Protestant, because they became Calvinists. Okay? In fact, Louis did. He took over the Spanish Netherlands. But when England, Sweden, and the new Dutch Republic threatened to unite against him if he annexed the Spanish Netherlands, he surrendered 95% of it. Gave it back, but kept the rest for himself, which brought about the annexation of several Flemish cities into the Kingdom of France, although at the cost of future bad relations with the Dutch Republic that will lead to future wars with them. With each success, in war or peace, Louis took over more and more of the politics that ran his country. He became what today we would call a micromanager. No minister could sign anything without the king signing it first. When he instigated the Third Dutch War later on, things did not go well, since virtually all of Europe formed an alliance against him, due to the previously discussed concept of the balance of power. But he did manage to pull off somewhat of a victory by gaining the territory of Alsace. Remember Alsace and Lorraine? Alsace and Lorraine have always gone back and forth, and remember the Germans took Alsace and Lorraine in the Franco-Prussian War, and that's what caused World War I. And then the French took it back after World War I, and that's what caused World War II, or one of the things that caused World War II. Anyway, this is one of those strange wars that saw, among a couple of rare things, a rare occasion of England and France were on the same side in this war, or at least fighting for the same thing. Both nations were attempting to annex the newly formed Dutch Republic, but the Dutch and their new leader, William of Orange, proved to be a tough customer. He was a worthy adversary. And the upstart Dutch Navy held its own against the mighty British and French fleets. Of course, as you know, remember William of Orange? He will eventually become King of England, William III. Remember William and Mary? Okay. As a consequence of the overthrow of James II in the Glorious Revolution, which we talked about when we were in England. One unfortunate thing, however, was one other thing this war marked. It was the last time, I think up through to today, it's the last time France had a balanced budget. But don't laugh. It's been a long time since we've had a balanced budget too. So, although with Paris burning, who knows how much it's costing them now? Okay. Perhaps the biggest mistake of Louis's reign was his revocation of Henry IV's previously discussed Edict of Nantes. Remember, the Pope wanted Louis XIII to do it and wanted Cardinal Richelieu to do it, but they didn't. Well, Louis says, okay, I'll do it. He revokes the Edict of Nantes, which in 1685 he does this. Remember, the Edict of Nantes gave religious freedom to the Huguenots, to the Protestants in France, after they'd fought this huge civil war over the issue of repression of the Protestants by the Catholic majority. Well, Louis decides he didn't think Protestants could be loyal to him, so therefore he was going to stamp them out. All it did was reinforce the hostility not only of French Protestants, but those from outside France as well, creating many new enemies for France. Somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 Protestants chose exile and moved to nations along France's periphery. These refugees were not peasants and serfs. No, they tended to be artisans, manufacturers, merchants, and bankers who took their talents to Britain, the Netherlands, and Germany, who all prospered thanks to their much-in-demand skills. This is a situation not unlike what occurred in each instance of the expulsion of the Jews, not only in France and England, but other European countries, and later on in Spain. In Spain's case, it was Jews and Muslims were expelled at the same time. Louis was of the traditional mindset of the time that being of a different religion than the king was suspicion of treason. And he just could not tolerate the challenge to his authority, and felt that his ego had convinced him that he would be able to carry this off without any negative consequences. In this, by the way, he was wrong. But what was it like to be this Louis XIV you see in the painting here? To the 21st century visitor to Versailles, where there are several copies of this painting. One of them hangs in Versailles, another one's in the Louvre. He may seem quaint and maybe even a little ridiculous with his elaborate regalia of wig, white hose, and red high heels, which, by the way, he designed himself. The artist had no illusions of painting a lifelike portrait, but rather a portrait that would glorify his subject as the epitome of a divine right monarch. But it is a well-designed illusion. The wig hides his bald head. The toothless smile hides the fact that he had lost all of his upper teeth. Must have made eating pretty hard to do. The heroic stance hides his gout. The red high heels his shortness. and the regal's smile hides the fact that his nation was bankrupt and on the verge of what historians have described as the most catastrophic revolution in history. Although now they qualify that with a possible exception of the ones in Russia and China in the 20th century, which certainly killed a lot more people. Okay? Yet Louis particularly admired this painting, which was meant as a gift for Louis's grandson, Philip V, the King of Spain. How did his grandson become King of Spain? We'll get to that. But Louis liked it so much, he kept it for himself and commissioned another copy to be sent to Philip. The first, as I said, of many such copies. Whenever he was absent for a council of ministers meeting, it was carried into the room to represent the royal presence. And when people walked by, they did a little curtsy as they walked by. The painting! Okay? Of course, this was only one of many hundreds of portraits of Louis XIV that were reproduced throughout the kingdom, often showing the same knightly leg and going to the furthest reaches of allegory. There was Louis as Apollo, as the Good Shepherd, as the defender of the faith, as protector of the arts, or the conqueror of heresy, as the miracle worker curing scrofula, or a St. Louis, or the Roman emperor straddling a horse as elaborately dressed as himself. There seemed to be no past hero from Caesar to Augustus to Constantine, or Charlemagne to Clovis to St. Louis, or St. Louis, if you will, who could escape identification with the Sun King. Presiding over a glittering residence reminiscent of the Palace of the Sun in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Let's talk a little bit about Versailles. Not a bad place. How many have been there? Everybody's been there. It's pretty much. Well, if you ever visit Paris, you have to take the bus trip out to Versailles. Okay? Originally, it was a small hunting lodge built for Louis XIII. It will become the envy of all the monarchs of Europe. Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, the Tsar's Winter Palace or Summer Palace, Vienna's Schönbrunn Palace, or Philip II's Escorial in Madrid, all paled in comparison to Versailles. And that's how they felt. The Hall of Mirrors probably is the most famous room. That's where the Treaty of Versailles was signed, by the way, at the end of World War I. Not until 1919, however. The war ended in 1918, but it took a lot of negotiations to put this treaty together. But Versailles was not just a fancy place to live. There was a minutely regulated etiquette of the Versailles court, sort of a royal liturgy, if you will, described by Louis's biographers and court historians of the day. For example, probably the most important room in the palace was the king's bedchamber. Okay? And yes, you can barely see it behind the curtains there, okay, back there, but I believe it is a king-size bed. Okay? The daily show began here, in what is known as the king's petit lever. The petit lever, or initial rising ceremony, took place at 7:30 a.m. when he was examined by the royal doctors in presence of close family members and a few specially honored courtiers, members of the court. These were joined by a group of court officials to whom the king gave instructions, sometimes while he performed his natural functions on the royal commode, or toilette, and had his wig and beard treated. Then followed the grand levee, in which were admitted ambassadors, cardinals, and other leading figures of the kingdom. He ate a light breakfast in his dressing gown and then dressed, the garments being handed to him by the Dauphin or some other family member, after which he prayed, utilizing a small kneeler in his bedroom. Having given everyone their marching orders for the day, the council chamber, in the council chamber, he proceeded to the chapel for Mass, trooping with his retinue through the great gallery thronged with courtiers and important visitors eager to be noticed, or maybe even had previously obtained permission to have a word with him. He ate dinner at noon, watched by a restricted group of standing courtiers, though often joined at the table by his next-in-line brother, known as the Monsieur, and who handed him his napkin and then invited to sit down. The evening meal would be an elaborately ceremonial public affair, with the family members eating off gold-gilded plates, watched by a select group of invited guests, the ladies sitting and the men standing throughout. The arrangements for bedtime were a mirror image of those in the morning, with men of high rank vying for the honor of holding the gold-gilt candlestick. From morning to night, Louis's life, even the normally private parts, was a public performance. This, I believe, that's the king's the rest of his bedroom there. That's the part that's the one I already showed you, wasn't it? Okay. This tightly choreographed ballet mirrored the etiquette of the court, which combined order, precedence, and elaborate conventions. To survive at Versailles, you had to know a plethora of unwritten rules. That you removed your hat if the king passed by, that only the princes and princesses could sit in his presence, and so on. And you also had to know the mysterious exceptions to those rules. And these hierarchical differences operated in minute detail, right down the social scale. At one level, it was reassuring to live in an ordered society that defined your exact social rank and told you what to wear or say or do on what occasion. So enveloping was this prestigious center of power that many of the grandees and nobles felt that there was no salvation away from the king, and that they could neither afford nor bear to be absent from all the networking going on, the lavish entertainments, the amorous encounters, and the possibility of a retainer or a rewarding position or sinecure. To be invited to live at Versailles was one of the greatest honors a nobleman could achieve. But watch what you say, for all the servants and chambermaids doubled as spies for the king. The least little transgression or slip of the tongue could get you banished from the palace. At another level, there was the frustration of failing to get noticed, the discomfort of living in a cramped and smelly conditions. The guest rooms had no toilets and no running water, so many threw the contents of their chamber pots out the nearest window. And under the spying eyes of Louis the servants, the jealousy, the infighting, and the fear of perpetuating some terminally faux pas. Yes, there's a reason that this term is still in its original French. Faux pas, okay? Like the rich young officer who committed the unspeakable crime of attending the wrong ball, was brusquely rejected from the event, never survived the ridicule, and ended up committing suicide. Or the gentleman who came to Versailles regularly over a 10-year period to solicit the king and never even got selected for an audience. Versailles was an ongoing fancy dress party where vices were tolerated, but where the slightest gaffe could resonate and kill. For everyone was on show. And this grand performance theater, what today we would call a virtual reality show. However, he managed to have over a dozen mistresses and dozens of children with them during and amidst all of this. How he was able to do that is beyond me. Everyone knew who the master of ceremonies was of this great masked ball, since everywhere you went, you were reminded of the Sun King. This sun image. Is it there? Don't see it. There it is. The Sun King. Everywhere you went, on all the doors and everywhere. But let us not forget the purpose of all this, to control the nobility and enlist their support for whatever project Louis had in mind. For Louis was in constant need of money. None of this stuff comes cheap. And support for something he considered more important than all. War. The waging of war. That was Louis's hobby. Well, because Louis needed so much money, because he was always at war, he realized he had a problem with his first finance minister, the rich and brilliant, finance. His name was Fouquet, who he dispossessed and imprisoned for life on the charge, not too clearly established actually, of fraudulent self-enrichment, which, well, guess who else was self-enriching themselves? Anyway, which apparently was only a crime if the king were displeased. This at once told the shocked nobles who was in charge, which may tell us why he did it, more so than wanting to get rid of a finance minister that he didn't pick. Especially since Louis now brought in Fouquet's replacement, the man who had accused him earlier, the man who had accused Fouquet, that is, the ambitious and energetic Jean-Baptiste Colbert. I believe that's him. Colbert, he has a descendant who has a late night show on TV. Way past my bedtime though, so I never watch it. With Colbert, he pushed forward the centralization, the centralization that would become the hallmark of the French state, imposing on the provinces more state commissioners, directly appointing the mayors of larger towns, cleaning up the local finances. Two of his most famous quotes that he's famous for are, and I quote, "It is simply and solely the abundance of money within a state that makes the difference in its grandeur and power." And the other one is, and I quote once again, "The art of taxation consists in so plucking the goose as to obtain the largest number of feathers with the least possible amount of hissing." Unquote. Unfortunately, a great amount of hissing is just around the corner by way of the French Revolution. Colbert shared Louis's dream of making France the most powerful and brilliant country in the world. At once a new Rome, but also a new Athens. To that end, he encouraged industry and trade, created state-owned factories, reorganized state finances and the court system, built up the Navy from 18 ships to 276 by 1683. He founded the East and West Indies companies and promoted the arts. As a mercantilist, he believed that national wealth depended on accumulating gold by exporting goods while restricting imports with tariffs. The disadvantage of this protectionist approach, as we all know, obviously was that other countries would retaliate, in that at a time when Britain and the Netherlands were expanding through free trade. Amsterdam had the biggest banks in Europe, for example, and France's approach might have been a little too inward-looking. And this is the point at which Louis's foreign policy began to conflict with the country's domestic needs. But Louis had no time for that. He had wars to fight. And fighting wars was indeed his greatest pastime. Most of these wars' original goal was to strengthen France, but ended up being fought to maintain the balance of power. Sometimes not through Louis's fault, but those he opposed or opposed him. In this way, these wars presented their own self-contained paradox. As Louis became victorious, the other powers of Europe would form alliances against Louis to prevent France from upsetting the balance of power. Since the whole idea of balance of power, remember, meant not letting any one nation get too powerful. for fear it would dominate all of Europe. Louis apparently thought the rest of Europe would make an exception for him. They didn't. Throughout his reign, he fought several wars to keep the Habsburgs from gaining too much power. But, and here's the irony, in doing so, he himself became too powerful, thus inviting the rest of Europe to oppose him, as I just kind of said. These wars followed a familiar pattern. As both sides exhausted themselves in the fighting, they would start to negotiate, usually reaching a compromise which gave everybody a piece of the European pie, usually. But as you can see from the map, all the colored in areas there that you see, the orange and the green and the blue, those are all areas that Louis added to France. Notice how they're along the periphery of the Habsburg ruling Holy Roman Empire. Okay? So we know what he had in mind. Often these wars involve dynastic issues, usually to determine who succeeds a king who has no heirs. There were many of this kind, but Louis's last war will serve as the prime example. This war will involve the all-important succession to the throne of Spain, and is therefore called the War of the Spanish Succession. I've talked about it many times before, up till now, because it involved almost every nation of Europe. Okay? In England, they called it Queen Anne's War, because it took up most of her reign. Queen Anne was the last of the Stuart monarchs, you'll recall. It was fought from 1701 to 1714, and is one of the, as I said, the most important wars in European history. The last Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II, was old, sick, dying, and most importantly for our story here, heirless. Not hairless, heirless. Okay? This concerned all of Europe because whoever would succeed him would not be just getting some little corner of Germany that hardly anybody cared about. No. Whoever inherits this throne will rule a rather large and valuable empire, the Spanish Empire. In this map, anything that is of the olive drab color, well, all the color that you see there, that is, I don't know, what color is Spain there? Somebody help me out here. Green, light green, olive green, olive drab green. But look at all the areas that are that same color. Those are areas that Spain controls. Okay? And as if that's not enough, here's a map of the world. And Spanish in this one is kind of a gold color, which is very appropriate since what did they find in the New World? Gold. By the ton. By the ton. Okay? What was gold selling for today? They sell it by the ounce today. I don't know how many ounces are in a ton, but there are a lot. There it is. Spanish Empire in America. Here's Spain. They had in the Indies, the spice trade. I mean, whoever inherits this throne, I mean, going to become pretty powerful. Not only do they take over the large holdings in Europe, but also in the New World and elsewhere throughout the world. Now, at the conclusion of the 9 Years' War, which we barely mentioned earlier.
What year was that?
What, the 9 Years' War?
When did it end?
When did 9 years? I don't know. I don't have it here. Yeah. Yeah, you're very good, very good. I like that. I like that. I think it was 9 years, too. There were two treaties that were supposed to solve this problem. The first named a Bavarian prince as Charles' successor, but he died shortly after its signing, so he's out. So a second treaty named Austrian Archduke, Habsburg by the way, as the heir to the Spanish throne, with various pieces of real estate going over to France in an attempt to keep Louis happy. It didn't. But Louis had other plans. He convinces Charles II on his deathbed to designate Louis's grandson, Philip, as his heir. Philip is a Bourbon, like Louis is.
Oh, what?
A Bourbon, the House of Bourbon, the dynasty that we're talking about. Who at that moment, and when he became King Philip, he became founder of the Spanish Bourbons, which, by the way, the present King of Spain today, Philip VI, is a member of the House of Bourbon. So it still exists. Now, why would Louis want his grandson on the Spanish throne? Could it be that our Louis is thinking of maybe, I don't know, uniting France and Spain into one powerful, wealthy, Catholic nation and empire, since the same grandson, since he's Louis XIV's grandson, isn't he also in line to become King of France? Of course he is. Of course he is. I don't know, maybe they'll change the name of the country. They'll call it Spance. Or Frame. Okay? And they'll come up with a new language called Frenish. Or Spench. Okay? Well, that's exactly what pretty much the rest of Protestant Europe thought, since they all went to war to stop Louis from doing this. And this is why it's called the War of the Spanish Succession. Okay? Since they feared how powerful this would make Louis and his heirs, and not to mention France. But this war, probably more so than the others I've been talking about, had clear winners and losers, at least much more clear cut than in the previous ones. The treaty that ended this war was the Peace of Utrecht, signed in the Dutch city of Utrecht. 1713, it was negotiated over the period of several years, 1713 to 1715, concluded the war and provides us with a clearer picture of who won and who lost. Philip, first of all, the treaty said, okay, Philip, Louis XIV's grandson, was acknowledged the King of Spain and the founder of the Spanish Bourbons, who still rule Spain today, although they don't rule because Spain's pretty much a republic. But he had to renounce any possible succession to the French throne. So no uniting of the two countries. Okay? So the same person could never be the king of both. In return for this, Louis had to acknowledge several things. He had to acknowledge Queen Anne's succession to the throne of England and give up supporting the Stuart pretenders to the throne, to the English throne, that had been disrupting things in England since 1688. France also ceded most of Canada and the island of St. Kitts to England. And in return, most of the French land seized by England and her allies during the war were returned to France, but not Canada. Okay? The Spanish were forced to cede the Spanish Netherlands to Austria. Spain also ceded Gibraltar. You ever wonder what the English are doing with Gibraltar, which is a tiny little spit of land in southern Spain that juts out into the Strait of Gibraltar? It's right here. The Strait of Gibraltar, and this little tiny spit of land belongs to England. Great Britain. Here's why. The British grabbed it the first year of the war. They sent a naval fleet down there and they grabbed it. Now, why would England, which is up here, want a tiny little piece of land down here? Do you have any idea how important straits are in world history still today? I mean, well, you can't see it on this map. But look here, we have the Bosphorus Strait. The Bosphorus Strait right here controls who comes and goes from the Black Sea. Over here, you can't see it, so it'd be about right there. Is the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
The Strait of Hormuz controls who comes and goes from the Persian Gulf into the Arabian Sea. And who controls the Strait of Hormuz? Who has all the land on one side? Our good friends, the Iranians. Yeah. And the last 6 or 8 presidents of the United States told Iran, who threatens almost daily to close Hormuz, that if you do, the United States Navy will take it back the next day. And just to help us be able to do that, in case it has to be, the English gave us a little island out here in the Indian Ocean called Diego Garcia, which we took over. We have tons and tons of weapons stored there, tons and tons of fuel, all sorts of stuff. So that if we ever have to send the fleet to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, we can. And why is who cares about the Strait of Hormuz? Oil. Oil. I know you don't like it. I know it's going to kill us all in the next 14 minutes. But you and I got here on oil. Okay? Even if you drive a Prius, you got here on oil. Okay? Yeah, pretty important stuff. So whoever controls straits controls the world. Why do you think the Chinese are building those phony islands in the South China Sea? So they can control the world, the southeastern part of Asia. That's why. Okay? And do you remember when Prince Charles married Lady Diana? I know it's a sad thing to think about today. But when Prince Charles married, you remember what their first stop was on their honeymoon? Gibraltar. And that's why King Juan Carlos of Spain, who was sent an invitation to come to the wedding, he didn't show up because he considered that an insult to the territorial integrity of Spain, that they would have the first stop on their honeymoon, Gibraltar. And he didn't even send a gift, even though they were registered at all of the usual places. Okay? Have you ever wondered why, when Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of Britain, and the Argentinians took that little island that the English call the Falklands, and the Argentinians call Los Islas Malvinas? You ever wonder why England spent so much of their treasury and blood? They lost a couple of ships were sunk to take back an island that was populated by 25,000 sheep and about 200 people? You ever wonder why they did that? Why didn't they just tell the Argentinians, help yourself? Why? Because they didn't want Spain to get any ideas about taking Gibraltar. You ever wonder why England was on the winning side in World War I and again in World War II? Because they controlled who came and went through the Mediterranean Sea. They could stop German U-boats from going through the Strait of Gibraltar. And they did. They stopped a lot of them. Some of them they didn't, but they did stop a lot of them. Does anybody know why Rommel had to abandon North Africa in 1943? Because he ran out of supplies. Because the English Navy controlled the southern Mediterranean Sea. Not as one-sided as you might think, because the Germans did manage to cause a lot of trouble in that part of the world. But the Strait of Gibraltar, enough cannot be said about controlling the straits of the world. And that's why the British took it, and that's why they still have it today. The Union Jack flies over Gibraltar today. Yes, the Spanish and the English are negotiating right now for a potential handover, but don't hold your breath. Don't hold your breath, okay? Yeah, and yeah, the whole Brexit thing is all tied up with this too, because a lot of people, the people in Gibraltar, they wanted to stay in the European Union. And as we all know, Britain's trying to break away, although we'll see how that goes. Okay, question?
Yeah, the Germans could get to North Africa without going through Gibraltar.
Oh yeah, but they wanted to go, they had to come across the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
See, they controlled Italy, they controlled southern France here, they could come this way.
Yeah.
At least they controlled southern France after the invasion.
What
And
did
they,
Gibraltar have to do with it?
because the British need to get their navy out here. That's the only way. They could come through the Suez Canal, but it'd be much better because here's Britain up here. They need to get their navy out into the Mediterranean Sea. Pretty important body of water. Yeah. Okay. England also was awarded the Asiento contracts. We've talked about this before. One of those unfortunate results of slavery, the world slave trade. The Asiento contracts, so many slaves were used in the Spanish-American Empire that whoever was able to sell those slaves to the Spanish in America got rich. It was a very lucrative trade. And so until England abolished the slave trade in 1808, I believe it was, they had the right to sell slaves to the Spanish in America. Okay? So who won? Who won this war? Well, England definitely came out smelling like a rose, as they say. And France and Spain, they were now not, France was no longer the predominant nation of Europe. Who was? England was. From here on out, this war marks the ascension of England as the premier power of Europe, and Britannia will rule the waves, at least until World War II. Okay? The same year as the treaty was concluded, Louis XIV, who reigned magnificently and splendidly, not to mention expensively, died of gangrene at Versailles after a reign of nearly, as I said, 72 years, just short of his 77th birthday. He lived so long that almost all of Louis's legitimate heirs predeceased him. 3 died in 1 week. During a tragic measles epidemic, his grandson Philip is out because of the terms of the Peace of Utrecht that we just discussed. So that left his great-grandson, also named Louis. Sorry about this. It's not my fault. Remember, I'm a mere conduit. The Duke of Anjou was his title, who would become Louis XV. At his deathbed, once again, historians argue about these deathbed scenes, you know. At his deathbed, he summoned his heir and told him, gave him some advice. He told him he should try to get along with his neighbors. And as he had been too fond of war, and he should instead look after the welfare of his subjects. Advice the new king would at least try to follow. But by now, France's economic woes were too serious to be solved by just taking a new direction. And the next 2 Bourbons would tragically learn this lesson. Like anyone who is just too successful, and I think we could probably describe Louis as in most cases too successful, in leadership role especially, there's a built-in negative. When one attains such a reputation of magnificence, one has to wonder what will happen when he's gone. For even the Sun King was a mere mortal. And it's as if the larger a person becomes in political power, the larger his shadow extends over everything. And that shadow darkens everything it touches. Pity his successors. What they will do except try, what can they do? Except try to emulate Louis XIV's example. Of course, they will fail, but everyone was so dazzled by the Sun King's image, they will have no choice but to try. So what follows, pretty much starting now, what follows is indeed a sad, sad story. So let's talk about Louis XV, whose nickname was the Well-Beloved. The Well-Beloved. Okay? You have to feel sorry for poor little Louis XV. He was orphaned at the age of 2 when practically his whole family contracted measles and smallpox and died. His grandfather had earlier died of measles. A little later, his father, mother, older brother contracted smallpox and all died within several days. Of course, the standard treatment for almost anything back in those days was bleeding. Medical science was a joke. I just hope that 300 years from now, they're not saying the same thing about our doctors that we go to today. Who knows? But it was the standard practice. You all know about George Washington, don't you? He was December in 1798 or 99, I can't remember now. He went out to mark trees on his plantation at Mount Vernon. It was a cold, sleety day. He came back. He kind of felt his throat was a little swollen. So he summoned his overseer, and he said, take a pint of blood out of me. And over the next 2 days, doctors came and drained 4 more pints of blood out of him, for a total of 5 pints. Poor guy probably died of loss of blood. Okay, but he died nonetheless. Okay, Louis's governess took him, and for whatever reason refused to let the doctors bleed him, probably saving his life. He was the only one to survive in his family. Imagine taking an orphan child of 2 and making him the absolute monarch at 5 of the most powerful nation in the world. Pretty amazing. That's monarchy for you. And probably one of the main reasons why it's kind of rare these days. At least absolute ones are. So for the 3rd consecutive reign, there will be a regency, ruling in place of the king while he is in his minority. But this time, unlike in 1610 with Louis XIII and 1643 with Louis XIV, there will be no queen mother available to play a leading role, nor a powerful, able minister to assist her. In fact, the leading candidate for the office of regent was the late king's nephew, Philippe, the Duke of Orleans. Who, believe it or not, during his whole regency, he was next in line to become king. So this is kind of an amazing story. I don't know why they haven't made a movie about it. Okay? But he was considered unfit for the role, mainly because of his low moral character and sexual depravity, both of which he had cultivated since his childhood. Does this shock you? Louis the 14th, second wife and widow, had nagged her husband into leaving a will relegating Orleans to a lesser status. But Louis had left his will with the Parliament of Paris, who had traditionally decided such sticky issues as who would be the regent, and so they decided that Philippe should be. The Parliament interpreted this action, that they had the power to do this. Remember, Louis's second wife was a commoner, and their marriage was a morganatic one. A morganatic marriage is a marriage in which the heirs are not in line, are not eligible to inherit any throne. Morganatic. So through careful manipulation and influence peddling, Orleans, I'll call him Orleans from now, since he was the Duke of Orleans, got himself appointed regent for the duration of Louis XV's minority. Once he established his authority, Orleans did a good job of looking after the political and sometimes emotional needs of his young charge. Not an enviable task, as France's economy was a disaster. The nation was filled with uncultivated land, impoverished peasants, indebted not only to the king, but also to their local landlord. The local village lenders also, they owed a lot of money too. In addition, manufacturing was at a halt, merchants were bankrupt, and the troops were on the verge of mutiny. Orleans wisely decided to take care of the troops first, which probably staved off the revolution for a few more decades. Unfortunately, though, Orleans' attempts to modernize the French economy, despite earlier small successes, utilizing Scotsman John Law's mercantilist ideas, coupled with the introduction of paper money, backed up by the nation's possession of bullions, gold and silver, and the idea of taxing production, which, with all the classes paying, will all come to failure, since the problems were just too big to overcome. And by the way, on the paper money idea, Voltaire famously and sarcastically quipped at this time, all paper money sooner or later is reduced to its intrinsic value. Let us hope he's wrong. To keep other things on an even keel, Orleans, to his credit, made no attempt to change the court personnel, and most of Louis XIV's intendants were still at their post when the young new king reached his majority. That happened when Louis XV reached his 13th birthday in February of 1623. For months, the regent had a series of meetings with the goal of formally preparing the young man for his rule. These meetings went very well, and the young king was very appreciative. Orleans often treated Louis with a mixture of lightheartedness and respect. Louis called him uncle and trusted him. With the regency ended, he asked the Duke to stand by his side and appoint a close friend of Orleans as his first minister. But by the end of the year, both men would be dead, leaving young Louis XV with the daunting task of filling his great-grandfather's shoes with only his aged tutor, Cardinal Fleury, another cardinal, to guide him. As it turned out, Louis XV was elegant and cultivated, but his traumatic childhood left him emotionally vulnerable and dependent on senior figures, including his governess, the regent, and then the elderly upright Cardinal de Fleury, who served for 17 years as his minister. Partly because of his dependency, no doubt, as well as by his temperament, he only worked at kingship by fits and starts. Though he could act energetically on occasion, he spent most of his time hiding his shyness beneath a certain formal coldness, lacked self-confidence, did not readily trust his ministers, and was prone to bouts of depression. To relieve the strain and boredom, he liked to go hunting. Now, despite the king's young age, it was decided that he needed to marry as soon as possible. After all, another smallpox epidemic or measles epidemic could come in any day, in order to avoid another succession crisis. The family had earlier promised Louis in marriage to the daughter of Philip V of Spain, who was already living in Paris in preparation for that wedding day, still years away. But there was a problem. She was only 3 years old. So the marriage would take place 10 years later. But a lot can happen in 10 years, so a suitable and older spouse search was initiated. A likely candidate was found in Maria, Laszyńska, the daughter of the exiled king of Poland. She was strong, somewhat attractive, Roman Catholic, and best of all, 18 years older than the Infanta, who was sent packing back to Spain. It was love, or at least lust, at first sight, as it usually was for Louis and almost every woman he met. They married, and a Dauphin was born in 1729. Between 1727 and 1737, the couple had 2 sons and 8 daughters, of whom only 1 son and 6 daughters lived to adulthood. Unfortunately, however, this seemingly happy marriage didn't completely occupy his time, as he went through a succession of mistresses, many of which were often frowned upon as commoners or prostitutes, and also had a busy lover's nest at a park in Versailles. And once again, I know you're not shocked. While he was well-liked initially, these character faults played a part in his later unpopularity, particularly after he took a mistress with him to war in 1744, considered a no-no. This led to a later unsavory scene when he became very ill and he was at death's door with a fever, and the priests were summoned to issue him the last rites of the church, but they refused to do because of his licentious ways, unless he repented before witnesses and in writing, which he did, and he recovered, only to find that his embarrassing repentance was being read out loud from every pulpit the following 2 Sundays. Needless to say, his reign was marked by confusion and uncertainty. Eventually, the confusion at court became such that the main stabilizing factor was the arrival of, you guessed it, another mistress. This one, however, is the famous Madame de Pompadour. Commoner in origin, with the unfortunate name of Mademoiselle Poisson, or Miss Fish, if you prefer, if you will, which inevitably led to cruel jibes called poissonades. She was nevertheless stylish, beautiful, and talented. Be your own judge. She became Louis', well, he called her his immaculate marvel. I'm not so sure how immaculate she was, but maybe she was a marvel. Who knows? I don't know. As he called her, acting not only as political collaborator, but as some sort of a minister of pleasure, devising all sorts of entertainments to keep the shy and moody monarch amused. A great person of the arts, she was involved in such building projects as the military school, the Petit Trianon at Versailles, and the Place de Louis XV, the present Place de Concorde, at the end of the Champs-Élysées in Paris. She was a lover of the decorative arts, in particular, sponsored the creation of the Sèvres porcelain factory, and was an admirer, unlike Louis, of the new group of writers known as philosophes. More on them later. She managed her delicate situation with great skill, even after she ceased being Louis' mistress for health reasons. But it was a hard world, and when she did die of tuberculosis at the age of 42, while Voltaire mourned her as one who had, and I quote, righteousness in her soul and justice in her heart, the king's only passing comment was, too bad it rained on her funeral. She, of course, has given her name to a Rococo style in the decorative arts, as well as to big hair style, later popularized by Betty Grable and Elvis Presley. And inevitably, she lives on in many films and biographies, as you know. The main problem for the king, however, was the one of waging wars, and perhaps more important, finding the money to pay for them. The complex dynastic relationships of the monarchies across Europe made it difficult for a large country like France to keep out of the many already mentioned conflicts over succession that regularly arose. In 1733, France became involved in the War of the Polish Succession in an attempt to restore the Queen's father to the throne, the Polish throne. The attempt failed, but France did get the Duchy of Lorraine. They got Alsace, and then they got Lorraine. In 1740, the War of the Austrian Succession, France allied with Prussia against Britain and Austria. The French won a series of military victories and occupied the Austrian Netherlands. However, Louis subsequently returned the territory to Austria, for which he was lauded abroad, but heavily criticized for in France. Perhaps he was thinking of the admonition of his great-grandfather. In the 7 Years' War, 1756, 1763, yes, it lasted 7 years, alliances were reversed, and the French fought with their long-standing enemy Austria against Britain and Prussia. The French defeat resulted in the loss of most of her colonies, including the rest of Canada, but also a few ports in India to Britain, and we all know what the British did with those, marking a new low point in fresh prestige. The 7 Years' War was known as the French and Indian War here in America, and the British attempt to make the American colonists pay for it was a major cause of our Revolutionary War. All these losses caused mounting unpopularity with the king, who just tried to raise taxes. He took another mistress, the Madame du Barry, who was a former prostitute herself, but all they wanted to do was impose more taxes on the nobility. And wasn't going to work. And when he died, his 20-year-old grandson, who will become Louis XVI, and his Austrian-born Habsburg wife, Marie Antonia, or since she's in France now, she was known as Marie Antoinette, they will become the next monarchs. Upon hearing the news of the king's death, they reportedly both dropped to their knees, sobbing and saying, "We are too young to rule." But he was 15 years older than his grandfather was when he became king. Years before, it was Louis XV's former mistress, Madame de Pompadour, who uttered the famous and prophetic phrase shortly before she died, which was, "After us, le déluge." After us, the flood. And boy, was she right. So come next time, January 22nd, we will begin to discuss the reign of Louis XVI, but we will interrupt that discussion with, all teachers have their favorite lectures to give. And my favorite lecture will be next time.
Which is?
We will be discussing the intellectual, ideological underpinnings of the French Revolution, which includes two events which are usually discussed together: the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. So come by next January 22nd, and you will all be enlightened as I discuss that. Okay? Thank you very much.